Welcome to the Powerlifting Mentorship Program. I'm Tim Henriques, and I'm going to be your guide to learn everything there is to know about the awesome sport of powerlifting. I love powerlifting. I started competing when I was 17. I got hooked right after my first competition, even though I bombed out because I was an idiot, but I'm going to try to teach you guys what not to do. I then competed for 20 years. I've been coaching teams of powerlifting for the last 15 years. And I wrote a book that I poured my heart and soul into all about powerlifting. So I'm really excited to kind of accompany you on this journey. The goal here is to teach you to coach others in the sport of powerlifting, or just to make yourself as much of a badass as you possibly can be. So this is week one, and our objectives here are to understand key powerlifting fundamentals. If you're going to go into a sport or any field, you got to understand the key basics, the things that you simply cannot violate if you want to excel in that field. So the first question is, what does powerlifting test? Right? What component of fitness is the most important in powerlifting? Hopefully this one isn't too bad to answer, right? Powerlifting is all about strength. Okay? Of course, there are other components of fitness: muscle endurance, body composition, cardio, flexibility. But the key classic component that powerlifting tests, you want to see who the strongest is, you decide to do a powerlifting competition. So we need to really understand, well then, what is strength? So if we turn to the textbook, the simple definition of strength is it's the ability of the muscles to contract one time. This is typically measured with a 1 rep max. Surprise, surprise, that's what we do in powerlifting. But if we really want to understand what we're training, we have to have a little deeper analysis of what strength really is. So I posit that a better definition of strength is the ability to execute a motor pattern against maximal resistance. There's a couple of key elements in there. So our ability to execute a motor pattern, right? You can test strength a bunch of different ways. You might argue that throwing a football as far as you can is a good test of strength. Or maybe a shot put, or maybe punching some bag that can measure your force. Okay? In powerlifting, we've chosen to use a barbell to measure strength. And it's very simple, it's very objective, and it's probably one of the purest tests of strength. But you have to get out of your head that strength is a general property. Right? People love to think of strength as like the Hulk, right? And whoever, the Hulk is just super strong, and anything that's related to strength, he's just the best at. If this were true, the person who won the world championships in powerlifting would also win the world championships in weightlifting, would also win the world's strongest man, would also be the strongest arm wrestler and the strongest MMA fighter. But it doesn't turn out to be that way. Strength is specific. And this is due to the principle of specificity, which in short says you get good at what you practice. Okay? More detailed is known as the SAID principle, which means the body produces specific adaptations in response to imposed demands. So we are going to specifically adapt to the kind of training that we do. It's not a general adaptation. Just because you're strong in the gym doesn't automatically mean you're going to dominate on a football field. There may be a relationship, okay, and there may be a transfer, but it isn't just one universal thing of strength. Okay, so we have to remember that. The motor pattern is what we are trying to improve. And of course, in powerlifting, we're talking about the squat, the bench, the deadlift, the big three, and then if you want to throw in strict curls, you can. Okay? And when we look at all three, then we can measure total body strength because no major muscle groups have been left out. But we want to understand what that definition of strength is because that's what we're trying to improve. So can we execute a motor pattern against maximal resistance as optimally as possible? So if our goal then is to improve strength, we want to understand the different variables that then affect how strong someone can be. Okay? There's several different factors that affect strength. Some of these are changeable, some of these aren't as changeable. Generally, these are listed in order of the positive effect that we can have. Okay, so what makes us move, right? Humans are animals. The big difference between animals and plants is that we can move in our environment, and the reason we can move is because we have muscles and bones and joints, obviously, and some other tissues that allow us to do that. Okay? Muscles, of course, are the number one thing that allow us to move, and in move to execute that motor pattern. So muscles have a huge influence on strength. There's a lot of little things inside of muscles that are important, but there's two giant factors that you need to be aware of that are going to affect how much strength someone can produce. And the extra good news is both of these two factors are changeable. Number one, NMC. What the hell is that? Neuromuscular coordination. Okay? That means that that's the brain's ability to coordinate the muscles to produce, hey, there we go again, that motor pattern. So neuromuscular coordination. If we want to use a simple analogy, think of your body as a race car and think of your brain as the driver. Okay? The driver's ability has a pretty big influence on what you can do. You don't have to have unbelievably ginormous muscles to lift really impressive weight. Right? We can see that all the time on Instagram with lighter females just throwing around insane amounts of weight. Having said that, you could put the best NASCAR driver in a lawnmower and they're not going to go that fast, okay? Because the second factor is muscle size. When we talk about muscle size, we're not talking about how long a muscle is, we're talking about how thick a muscle is. In other words, its cross-sectional area. A thicker muscle can produce a lot more force. So in powerlifting, we are trying to optimize those two things. We need reasonable sized muscles. Okay, I could climb inside my 10-year-old right now, who only weighs 80 pounds, and there's no way that he or really anyone with that kind of muscle size could bench press 400 pounds. There's just not the horsepower there, even despite perfect neuromuscular coordination. If that was the case, you just can't lift that much weight. So we need that engine, right? We need that horsepower to be able to move a reasonable amount of weight. So muscle size is for sure important. But if muscle size was the only thing we cared about, then we would simply just see bodybuilders having the greatest total of anybody. And obviously bodybuilders are a hell of a lot stronger than the average population, but they're typically not as strong as the strongest powerlifters because they focus most on this, whereas a good powerlifter knows you got to focus a lot on your neuromuscular coordination. Okay, you don't need a massive amount of muscle. You need some, but you don't need a massive amount of muscle to greatly influence and improve your lifts. So of course, during our units, we're going to be talking about how to improve these things through program design. But neuromuscular coordination is a huge factor, and its influence, just think of that as technique and skill. Okay, practice is how we're going to improve that. Muscle size, we're going to force our muscle to grow under stimulus. A bigger muscle can then lift more weight. Okay, so both of those have a huge influence on strength. Okay, the next subject I don't think gets enough press, which is your joints. Your joints have a massive control as to how strong one can be. Okay, really what they can do is ultimately they can limit you. If you've ever had a bad injury or dealt with anyone who's had a bad injury, it becomes very obvious that when that joint doesn't work right, your strength goes unbelievably down. Okay, so what do we mean when we say joints? Well, first, a joint is where two bones meet, and joints obviously have different range of motion. In powerlifting, we're usually dealing with what's called the synovial joints, which have a large amount of range of motion. Typically, we're talking about the shoulder and the elbow, the hip and the knee, a little trunk and other stuff thrown in there. Okay, but these are big joints that allow us to have a lot of range of motion. The negative of having high levels of mobility is a lack of stability. So for example, our shoulder is the most mobile joint in our body because it's a ball and socket and because of the way it's particularly set up. Okay, that's great if I want to pitch a baseball, but when I'm trying to bench press, I don't want to have this huge level of mobility here. Stabilization increases activation. This applies both internally to the body and externally. So two examples. If I can make my body more stable, I will be able to lift more weight. Here's a pretty obvious example. Compare a bench press versus a bench press with your back on a physio ball or the big stability ball. Obviously, your weight is going to go down. Even though the range of motion would stay the same, you're still using a bar, we still have the same pecs, we still have the same shoulders and triceps and lats and everything else. Okay, but what happens is the body detects that instability in a joint. Okay, then it says, oh, if we transmit our maximal force across this joint, we may get hurt. So that instability in turn shuts off several muscles or the potential firing rate of the muscles, and you can't produce as much force. Okay, we can also see this, for example, externally in a squat versus a leg press. What can you usually do more weight on? Okay, almost anyone who's spent any time training on both knows that on a leg press, you can usually leg press more than your maximum squat, and often quite a bit more. Got the same muscles, same quads, same glutes, same hamstrings. Even if we can measure it, you should be able to have a similar range of motion. Okay? But the squat is inherently less stable, and therefore your joints don't conduct that force quite the same. So what we want to do is we want to have our joints as stable as possible. Some of this is just like technique and setup. So if I like benched like this, obviously my shoulders are a lot less stable than this. A huge thing that influences joint stability is body weight. When people talk about, oh, I gained weight and I changed my levers, that's total bullshit. But what they were trying to say is they gained weight, they packed mass around that joint, and honestly, sometimes it's fat, sometimes it's muscle, it doesn't matter. Okay, I mean, it matters a little bit, but packing mass around that joint increases its stability and thus increases your ability to produce force. Just to use a personal example, my whole life I always wanted to bench 400 pounds, and I was unable to do that at my regular competition weight of 198. And I tried and tried and tried and tried, and certainly maybe I missed some variables, but I did the best that I could, and I was not able to bench that. Okay, I decided, all right, I'm going to gain weight. I'm going to go to 220. So I added 20 pounds of mass, a lot of muscle, admittedly, some fat too, okay? But in able to do that, that packed my shoulders, and then my shoulders were able to transmit force, and I was finally able to hit that goal. And then as soon as I lost the weight, even training the same and doing different routines, the strength went away. This is also why things like powerlifting gear, like bench shirts and knee wraps, are so powerful. It isn't that the shirt literally does it all, but the shirt turns on these muscles, enables them to fire at that certain motor pattern even more, and that's why we can lift so much more weight. That's why using gear on a joint that's moving during the exercise, unlike just a belt, really changes the entire sport and should be thought of as something kind of totally separate. But joint stability is huge. We also need to prevent injury. Okay, if you hurt a joint, if I rip my ACL, my knee is suddenly not nearly as stable, and I'm going to have problems doing all sorts of different activities. So we want to prevent injury with our joints. We want to make our joints as stable as possible by surrounding them with mass and, of course, having strong muscles that cross those joints. And we want to put ourselves in as stable a position as possible. Okay, something else that's in there that most people aren't aware of is something called GTOs. Not a cool car, right? That stands for Golgi tendon organs. These are specialized proprioceptors inside our body. Proprioceptors are sensory cells that detect what's going on. We have two major ones right now. We're talking about the GTOs. Golgi tendon organs detect the load that is being transmitted through a tendon into a muscle and into a bone, right? So we take a quick step back. Your muscle turns to tendon, which then attaches to a bone. Okay, think of like a climbing rope that's anchored into rock, and you're pulling on that. Okay, your body has a way to detect how much tension's on there, because it is possible to snap a muscle or rip a tendon, and that sucks. You have to also think from an animal point of view. Not only does that suck from a powerlifting career, if you're an animal and you rip a muscle or tendon severely, that may mean death. Okay, so your body has sensors to try to prevent that from happening, and they're not perfect, but they're in there to try to keep you safe. Well, an untrained person has highly sensitive GTOs. In other words, let's say you could scan a person and their bicep could, in theory, curl 100 pounds. But they have a sensor set in to say, hey, if we lift over 100 pounds, we're going to rip that muscle. Well, the body doesn't set the sensor at 99 because you got to remember, you're outside, there's external things going on, you can't always tell how much force you're conducting. So the body likes to play it safe. It may set that sensor at anything over 50 pounds. And what that means is, if your body detects a load greater than, say, 50 pounds, in our example, what GTOs do is they turn off the muscle. Okay, I like to think GTO, TO, turn off the muscle. Okay, technically they inhibit the muscle, they shut it down. So now this person goes, who theoretically has the muscle strength to curl more than 50, but the sensors say, whoa, we don't feel safe doing this, we might get hurt, and they shut it down. So now that person can technically only lift 50 pounds. Okay, if you're in a lifting competition, that's very frustrating. So what happens is the more that you train, you desensitize your GTOs. So if your theoretical maximum strength is up here, okay, and then as a newbie, right, this is why newbies, they just seem so weak in the gym. This is one reason why. They have crappy neuromuscular coordination. They have GTOs that are super sensitive. So, but overtraining, they improve neuromuscular coordination, they improve their GTOs. Their overall max goes up because their muscle size and other things like that go up too. But this races up much closer. The good news is now they're much closer to the theoretical potential. The bad news is their threshold for injury is also closer. Okay, it'd be like having a fuse in your house. If you put that fuse just a little bit under what would cause a fire, okay, you're more likely to have an issue. Okay, most fuses are set to be extra sensitive and they get tripped more often. So what we do with training is we expose our body to load. Our body adapts specifically to handle that load. The GTOs get desensitized and they go up. You can often feel this if you've taken a long time off from, say, squats. Even though your muscles, maybe you can squat 500 pounds and you decide, okay, 2 months of no squats whatsoever. Okay, when you get back under that weight, your muscles haven't deteriorated that much, especially even if you did things like leg press and lunges and other exercises. But when you put that weight on your back, even 315, suddenly you're like, oh my God, this feels heavy. Okay, those GTOs have gotten then resensitive again, and then you have to go through the process of desensitizing them. Okay, and certain motor patterns are more sensitive to this than others. But the bottom line is joint stability is huge. So if we can make a joint more stable by, for example, using a wrist wrap or a belt, usually that's advantageous. We want to position ourselves during the lift to be as stable as possible. You hear powerlifters always screaming out, get tight, stay real solid. Okay, they're trying to have then that general tension. Okay, think of being loosey-goosey. Think of like someone tickling you, right? And how you feel like you basically have no strength there. Okay, when you're super loose, you don't conduct strength well at all. And then the third factor, which unfortunately we have the least influence on, is our general biomechanics, our lever system, essentially the way our body is set up. In powerlifting, certain lifts take advantage of certain biomechanics. So for example, in the bench press, one of the reasons why I always struggled with the bench press a bit, because my arms are reasonably long. Okay, that's a decent bench stroke, even when I do what I can to kind of shorten it out. Now, there's a time when that helps. Okay, you might think, hey, long arms, that's also why, no surprise, the deadlift was my best lift. Okay, if you have long arms and the bar is well below your groin at lockout, or better yet, like Lamar Gant, essentially at your knees, then of course you're going to be able to lift more, okay, in that particular lift. So with this, when we look at the squat, if you have a super short torso when you squat, that's going to force you to lean forward really far to keep the weight over your heels, and then that's going to be more of a disadvantage. So a longer torso coupled with shorter legs typically is really good squat form or good squat biomechanics. For the bench press, we want a nice thick barrel chest and shorter arms. Super long arms are not going to be as ideal. The body build of a little person, for example, is really awesome for the bench press. So that's kind of ideal build for the bench press to maximize your own biomechanics there. And then for the deadlift, we're looking for longer arms, okay, also not a super long torso, but nice long arms to really reduce that range of motion. But again, these are things that we can't really control. The nice thing is one factor in powerlifting, for example, like so being good at the deadlift may then hurt the bench with the long arms. They tend to balance each other out a bit. Obviously, each lift is not equally weighted, but they tend to balance each other out a little bit. Okay, but it's just useful to know you may have an athlete or you yourself may be built for one specific lift, you may not be built for another, but you can still get pretty badass at all of them with good training. Okay? So these are the primary factors that affect strength. And our job is going to be to maximize neuromuscular coordination, maximize muscle size as best we can, enhance joint stability, desensitize GTOs, and make best use of our biomechanics that we can. Okay. Now, what is fueling us? If we're going to conduct this strength, we need to have this energy to do this. Well, humans produce energy through what's called energy systems. And there are four main, depending on how you look at them, but four main energy systems. Okay, I have a pretty exhaustive video on this specifically for powerlifting, which I will link in your study guide. But I'm going to briefly talk about the main one that's associated with our sport, and that is the phosphagen energy system. So the function of an energy system is ultimately to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the chemical form of energy in the body. That's what makes us get up, move around, and do all sorts of different stuff. Okay? And in powerlifting, we are using our phosphagen energy system. Another name for it is the ATP-CP system. So when you look at energy systems, there's a couple of key things that you want to consider. Number one is, how long does the energy last? Phosphagen energy system is short in duration. Typically, it lasts about 0 to 6 seconds full power. Okay, it can't maintain that strength all the way throughout, and then by about 30 seconds, it's done. Okay, so it will be pretty much spent if you've been going full bore. Okay, so very short. It's the shortest energy system we have. On the flip side, It's also the most powerful energy system that we have, okay? If you are ever trying as hard as you can, whether you suck or not, right? If you are trying as hard as you possibly can, you are using your Phosphagen energy system. It's associated with your type 2B or type 2X motor units and muscle fibers. Okay, if you're unfamiliar with them, we'll talk more about it. But basically, your body, your muscles are built up of different motor units, right? And some are better at speed and power, some are better at endurance. But when you're trying as hard as you can, you are basically turning everything that you have on at that time. The negative is this produces a huge amount of fatigue, which is why you can only last, again, 5-6 seconds full power and up to 30 seconds. Okay. The fuel for this, the Phosphagen system, is what its secondary name is. The fuel is ATP and CP. CP is creatine phosphate. That's why it's called the Phosphagen energy system, because it makes up of those two phosphates. Those fuels, ATP and CP, are located directly inside your muscle cells. Okay, so they're sitting right there and they are ready to go. There's no delay for this energy system to kick in. So if I want to just suddenly turn around and punch this wall or jump out of the way, I don't have to sit here and zen and charge up and think about stuff. I can generally just activate those instantaneously. So the fuel is ready. It does not have to be converted. It's directly inside the muscles, but only in small amounts. Okay, that's why you're going to burn through it quickly. This is what's considered an anaerobic energy system, meaning oxygen doesn't really play much of a role in this kind of contraction. A really simple rule of thumb is if you could hold your breath and do the activity just as well, it's definitely in the Phosphagen system. And of course, by holding your breath, you're not taking in new oxygen. Okay, so the ATP-CP system, right, fuel is that ATP and creatine. Now, this system can then get depleted, right? All it takes is you go get under a big set of 5 on squats, and how do you feel afterwards? Oh, man, I'm tired. Not only are you breathing heavy, right, but your muscles just feel drained. And if I just gave you 15 seconds and said, okay, jump back on there and do that set of 5 again, right, you're not going to be able to match what you did. But what if I gave you 10 minutes? Could you match? Probably, right? So each of those things need to recharge. Your ATP system recharges generally after 3 to 5 minutes of inactivity. Okay? And don't think of it as an all or nothing. So it's not like, 2 minutes and 59 seconds, nothing happens, and then 3 minutes, it's full recharge. Think of it like plugging your iPhone in or your cell phone, right? The longer you leave it in, the more it charges, but then it kind of comes to that point of diminishing returns, and it has basically maximal. Okay? So 3 to 5 minutes should have a near full recharge. CP takes a little bit longer. CP is 5 to 8 minutes to near fully recharge. It is possible if you did a super intense set that you wouldn't be able to duplicate it, but certainly if you did a set of 5, for example, you should for sure be able to get a set of 4 with 5 minutes of rest. Now your nerves also need to recharge, right? Going back to our neuromuscular coordination system. So the nerves need to recharge, and they generally take 5 to 15 minutes to recharge. So does this make any sense? Well, let's think about how we train for strength, and that's going to be a big focus next week. But just briefly, you probably know that we take longer rests when we're training for strength because we want to be fresh, we want to have good performance, we want to let our system recharge, right? So, and obviously, you could rest 10 minutes, but there is a point of diminishing returns, and then your workout just takes forever. But so most sets, right, you train for strength, 2 to 5, 3 to 5 minutes is generally what you're looking for to have that pretty good recovery to allow those systems to recharge. And if you were doing it on a max, or if you're in a powerlifting competition, you may find 3 to 5 minutes is not enough. Okay, that's why most flights are set up so that you would get, 8, maybe 10 or 15 minutes in between, and that should allow full recovery. If you start to rest more than 15 minutes and certainly more than 30 minutes, then generally your body starts to cool down, and that's less optimal. So even if you could, you wouldn't want to hit your first attempt at 1 o'clock and then your second attempt at 2 o'clock, right? That would be too much time in between. Okay, but about 10 to 15 minutes seems to be optimal for most athletes. For, again, more on that, see my video on energy systems and powerlifting. That's on YouTube. Now, since we're talking about powerlifting, right, one thing I like to do, I don't want to jump the gun, but I like to kind of look ahead and think, all right, well, what's our maximum human potential? Right? So say you could talk to someone, who's 17. I would have been curious, how strong could I possibly be? Well, we actually have some idea, general formulas that can be useful to predict how strong and how much muscle somebody can have. Greg Nuckols, on his excellent site, Stronger by Science, has put out some articles where he details some of the formulas, and he's set it up very user-friendly, where you can even plug in your own information and see what you got going on. But there's two main things that we want to talk about. And actually, it goes back to, well, our two main factors that affect muscle strength: neuromuscular coordination and muscle size. So the first thing is, well, how much size can I put on? I'm a 5'10" dude, right? Could I walk around at 300 pounds and 10% body fat? Is that feasible? And generally, without excessive steroids and other things like that, no, that's not feasible. Okay, there is a maximum amount of muscle that the body can produce. What's interesting to note is it's not finite. So you can't just look at someone walking around and be like, oh, you can maximally weigh 220. Because your body fat has an influence on how much muscle you can have. If you want to be super lean, like for example, if I wanted to get up on stage as a bodybuilder, there's no way I'd be able to walk around even at 220, okay, if I was natural, because I can't get that lean and have that much muscle at the same time. Okay, if I was willing to get hugely heavy, right, maybe I could walk around at 300 pounds, but then I would not be 10% body fat. So in general, when we talk about powerlifting in specific and strength, males typically have optimal muscle to strength ratio at around 10 to 13% body fat, give or take. And some males can walk around a little bit leaner, right? Some will walk around a little bit thicker than that. But if you're much heavier than that, that means you're carrying around obviously extra fat, and the fat may not be so useful, particularly in a weight class sport. But if you're super lean, if you're someone who, like me, when I was a kid, right, I wanted to look like Arnold but be super strong, that's tough to do, because to be that lean is hard. It's really difficult to maintain your maximal strength. So most males will walk around 13% body fat, give or take. Most females, maximize somewhere in the 20% range. If they drop too much below that, then they're getting really lean. If they go much above like 25%, they may be carrying kind of extra body fat. So at that amount of body fat, what's the most amount of muscle that somebody can have? Well, that amount of muscle is then determined by how much bone you have. Okay? And in general, we believe that a pound of bone can handle about 5 pounds of muscle through that. So if I just had, it wouldn't make any sense for me to have 15 pounds of bone attached, or 15 pounds of muscle attached to this bone here. The bone's not strong enough to be able to handle that. So in other words, the muscle would then literally break the bone or cause injury to it. That's the ratio I gave you, is what we believe is for men. For women, the bone's not quite as strong, so it seems like it's just over 4 pounds, like 4.1. And you could use kilograms or pounds, doesn't make any difference as long as you're consistent on both of those things. All right, so just to share some personal examples, again, I'm 5'10", with not a super huge frame, right? Like my wrist, I can pretty easily wrap my fingers around my wrist. My ankles and knees are a little bit thicker, but most people don't consider me like super short and stocky. I tend to be a little bit longer. So the formula is predicted for me walking around at about 13% body fat. My maximum weight would be about 203, 205 pounds, give or take. And this is, of course, not factoring in artificial help like steroids and things like that. So natural maximum muscular weight, that's what that would be for someone like me. Each person is built a little different. If we had Ed Cohn's numbers down here, that would be quite different, right? If you ever seen him, he's got super thick wrists, giant joints, really good leverage to do the power lifts. So of course he's going to be able to carry around more at a lower height. So once we have an idea of how much muscle we have, then we can kind of assume that most humans' neuromuscular coordination is going to be about the same. In other words, at a super high level, right, they're going to have to work really hard to get there, but it's going to be about the same. Just like in baseball, it isn't that most professional pitchers, could throw a fastball 100 miles an hour, but there's a guy out there who can throw 200, right? There's not that level of variation. There may be someone who can throw 102 or 104 or 97 or whatever, so there's going to be this pretty narrow variation. The same is true in powerlifting, right? You can only so optimize your bench stroke. You're not just going to be able to, be 198 and bench 1,000 pounds. It just doesn't seem like that's going to be possible. Okay? So if we use formulas to estimate what we believe the maximum neuromuscular coordination is, then we combine that with the person's muscle size, we can then predict reasonably, with reasonable approximation, what someone's maximum possible total would be. right? Just again, to use myself as a personal example. So when I plug those numbers in, so at that body weight of 203, 205 pounds, right, which you would cut down to 198 to do that, then it's going to predict a maximum total of a little bit over 1,600 pounds for me. So let's say I could go back in time and I was talking to myself and I was 180 pounds and I had a total of 1,200, okay? So I wanted to see, am I ever going to total 2,500 pounds? No, right? Just doesn't seem like that's going to be realistic or feasible at all, okay? But you could say, hey, you know, you may total, if you keep training, what do you need to do? Well, you're only walking around at 180, you don't have enough muscle on your frame, so you need to add more muscle, about 20, 25 pounds. And then if you continue to train and work hard, we can add, 400, 450 pounds to your total, give or take. Okay? That gives us an idea of where someone can be from and where someone can be. And the reason I think this is useful is because then we can start to work backwards, right? We can start to see, okay, how far away is that person from their potential? They're willing to ask the question, is it worth it, right? So if I only got into powerlifting to total 2,500 pounds, and then I was like, screw that, 1,600, that's not worth it, I could make that decision. But you can also then see where somebody is and what they need to work on. If someone's already at their maximum muscle size, so if you were talking to me and I could total 1,200 pounds, but I was already 205 pounds and reasonably lean, I don't need to worry about getting that much bigger. I may not be able to get that much bigger. My neuromuscular coordination sucks, right? In other words, I'm not as strong as I should be. Okay, on the flip side, maybe you see someone who's, maybe you're talking to a female who's 130 pounds, and she can squat, 315. That would be a really awesome squat at that weight. So her neuromuscular coordination may be awesome. If she wants to improve strength, she may have to get a little bit bigger, right? We may have to put a half an inch or an inch on her quad so she has more horsepower now to lift. So it's useful to know this just to see what the max is, okay? And then we can kind of work both forwards to try to get to a certain point, but we can also work backwards to see how far away we are from something. Now, it's also worth mentioning that there's going to be a few outliers on here. So, if you had an Ed Cohn or a Kirk Karwoski or something like that, you don't always predict what people's level are, right? If you were dealing with a 15-year-old Michael Jordan, it'd be tough to say, if with this and this and this, you'll be the best person ever. So there are certainly going to be some outliers, and I'm a huge believer in believing in yourself and challenging yourself and seeing what you can do, and humans are amazing for sure. But at the flip side, when we deal with broad groups, we can use this as a coaching tool to help our athletes see where they might go and what they want to do. Okay, so this covers some key fundamentals. We need to know what strength is. We need to know the factors that affect strength and how we can optimize them through training. We need to be aware of the energy system that's most important and spend most of our time training that, but we need to be aware of the other energy systems as well. And we want to have some idea as to what a maximum human potential, both muscle size and strength, is. Okay, next week, our number one focus is going to be to start to look at program design. And we want to tease out the differences between training for size and training for strength. Okay, what's different about that? And we want to know the general parameters for setting up programs that particularly focus on size, strength. We'll talk about power as well and how we begin to set up those kind of programs. So that's what we have coming up. If you want to read the chapters in the All About Program Design book that cover that as a preview, feel free. I would also check out chapters 1 and chapter 2 and All About Powerlifting just to familiarize yourself with exactly what powerlifting is, what it isn't, and the history of the sport, and we'll continue to move forward. Looking forward to working with you. Go out there and kick some ass with the weights.